Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Simon Carlson, and I'm the Director of Pre-Sales and Customer Advocacy at Haventec, and I'll be your moderator today. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. So joining me on the call is Dave Munsell, and Dave is the Chief Executive Officer at Haventec. So in the session today, Dave and I are going to be discussing why keeping MFA optional is leaving your organization exposed and is also leading to end user friction. And we're going to have a look at some of the alternatives to conventional multi-factor authentication. And then we're going to have a look at Silent MFA, which is a new type of multi-factor authentication that mitigates fraud and cyber threats without negatively impacting end user experience. And if you'd like to ask questions today during the session, please use the questions pane at any time, and then Dave and I will come back and answer those at the end of the session. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Dave Munsell. Dave, good morning.
Thanks, Simon, and hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us here today. Before we get in and introduce Haventec Silent MFA, a quick introduction to Haventec itself. Next slide, please. So Haventec was founded in 2015, and we're part of a emerging privacy-enhancing technology sector, and this sector is bridging the transition from Web 2.0 architectures to Web 3.0. It's characterized by businesses who embody a fundamental data protection principles by minimizing personal data use, maximizing data security, and ultimately empowering individuals. Another way of looking at that is at Haventec, we develop software products that enterprises can use to protect sensitive data, and this includes passwords, even if your enterprise or your cloud is breached. Our platforms have been independently cryptographically assessed, and those reports are available to interested parties. We also quite proudly took out the cybersecurity category wins for the two major industry awards last year here in Australia. We have a growing customer base and partner ecosystem, and we are really excited about the launch of our latest innovation, which is Haventec Silent Multi-Factor Authentication. Before I get into the solution, I do want to have a little bit of a conversation around how we got to this particular point. Next slide, please. Let's start with how most of our everyday digital interactions begin, and that's with the insanely successful username and password combination. In actual fact, so successful that we now have, on average, over 100 passwords that we need to manage, according to NordPass. Now, as a consequence of the proliferation of usernames and passwords and the popularity of that combination, 2 billion passwords were compromised in 2021. That's a 35% increase from 2020, according to ForDrop. What do we know about Australians from this data? So according to NordPass, the 10 most common passwords used by Australians were all easy to remember. In actual fact, the top Australian password stolen last year was 123456, and this was quickly followed by password as the top password. This pattern, unfortunately, is the same for the majority of countries that were included in the NordPass report. Now, another way of looking at this, or in other words, your customers, our customers, most Australians, they like to use and reuse passwords that are easy to remember. Now, paradoxically, do Australians care about their data being protected? According to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, privacy is a major concern for 70% of Australians. In actual fact, they care more about the protection of their personal information than price. So what are our customers telling us? On the one hand, they want simplicity. They want to get through the digital front door easily, and I'm sure you want them to do the same. But at the same time, they want you to protect their personal information. And interestingly, we know that multi-factor authentication is a very effective way of protecting their accounts. In actual fact, when turned on, 99% of accounts compromised by attackers did not have multi-factor authentication turned on, according to Microsoft. And this is also why we are seeing some regulators, ACMA here in the Australian market most recently, beginning to mandate multi-factor authentication for certain interactions. Next slide, please. Now, up to this point, technology's response to the shortcomings of passwords have more often than not added additional obligations to customers wanting to authenticate themselves. We're asking customers to not reuse their passwords. We're asking customers to use more complex passwords. And more often than not, we're asking customers to key in a 6-digit number to a phone or from an authentication app. More and more organizations are implementing conventional multi-factor authentication. What do we know about conventional multi-factor authentication from its implementation over the last decade? Its conventional multi-factor authentication is negatively impacting revenue. According to the FIDO Alliance, 58% of customers have abandoned a transaction due to difficulties when signing in. Conventional multi-factor authentication is discriminating against some of your customers. According to the W3C, it's estimated that complex authentication solutions discriminate against up to 15% of the population. And this in turn is reducing an organization's potential market size by up to 15% as well. Worryingly, opt-in adoption of conventional multi-factor authentication remains very low. According to Twitter, just 2.6% of their global user base has enabled multi-factor authentication because change is hard and it's inconvenient. And conventional multi-factor authentication can be compromised. Microsoft, in a note out to customers a couple of years back, is urging customers to stop using call and SMS-based multi-factor authentications, given they can be compromised quite easily. Next slide, please. So the question we asked ourselves when we went into the development stage for silent multi-factor authentication was, with such a low customer adoption of conventional multi-factor authentication, can enterprises really afford to keep it optional? Only 56% of enterprises have implemented multi-factor authentication, despite it being a very effective cyber threat mitigation. The majority of enterprises keep MFA optional, with data showing that less than 1 in 5 customers opting into it. And this means that more than 80% of customers remain exposed, and this presents its own enterprise risks. And the result is an erosion of the potential benefits of MFA and a lower return on investment from that MFA solution. Next slide, please. So this is why we have developed and launched Haventec Silent Multi-Factor Authentication. We believe there must be a better answer to providing enterprises with the means of implementing high assurance authentication without negatively impacting the customer experience. And we know that current approaches to strengthen password security are creating usability issues. These usability issues are leading to new threats, but ultimately at the end of the day, they are slowing down business. Next slide, please. So Haventec multi-factor authentication is multi-factor protection without the multi-factor friction. It's a familiar authentication experience Your customers simply enter their existing username and password just like they do now. It does not require them to change any behavior. No one-time PINs, no SMS or associated costs, no authentication apps, no tokens, no smart cards, no USB keys, and no QR codes. And every time they sign in with their username and the password, we complete a silent multi-factor authentication. And the solution has been designed and can be implemented to silently onboard customers if the brand or the enterprise doesn't want to go through a re-verification process as part of the introduction of the service. So what does this mean? It means no additional steps for customers. Organizations implementing silent multi-factor authentication do not need to take their customers out of brand or out of band. It works alongside your existing identity and access management or authentication solution, so you do not need to replace that. There is the zero change management implementation option, as well as the option to re-verify your customers as a one-off verification process. Your customers can sign in from any device, regardless of the platform they're using or the browser they're using right now. Haventec Silent Multi-Factor Authentication will help an enterprise reach maturity level 3 against the essential 8 multi-factor authentication criteria. And quite importantly, our keys, our private keys, are all one-time use, providing further protection to your customers and their online credentials. So how does it work? Which is a question typically at this stage of a discussion or an introduction to silent multi-factor authentication that most executives ask. And I'm going to hand over to Simon now, who's going to provide a high-level introduction to how silent multi-factor authentication works, walk you through a demo, a sample demo of the implementation and ongoing authentication using a silent multi-factor authentication, and then talk about some of the risks that the solution implements. So Simon, I will hand back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Next slide, please. Excellent. So when we were designing silent multi-factor authentication, one thing that was really important to us was that we would adhering to industry standards, particularly around the definition of multi-factor authentication. And to that end, we went to speak to the Australian Cyber Security Centre to make sure that we were following how they defined multi-factor authentication. And typically they define it as something the customer knows, something the customer has, and then typically either some form of biometrics, but also something that the enterprise holds as well. And we've designed Silent MFA to meet those standards. So how it works in your particular customer's case is that the customer can enter their username and password as they do traditionally today. So there's no change from a customer perspective. So they enter their credentials and the enterprise authenticates those against whatever directory they have in place today. So there's no change from that initial authentication. But then once they've authenticated successfully, the silent MFA process is invoked. And that's the point at which we look at what the customer has. And in this case, we are retrieving a derivative of a private key that is stored securely on the end user's browser. It is not the key itself, it is a cryptographically derived representation of that key. And we have a number of patents around that cryptographic process. So at that point, the user has something that they know because they've already logged in. We've retrieved their rolling dynamic key, which is something that they have. And then we send that authentication key and a device fingerprint to the Haventec SaaS service, and we run our cryptographic processes over that information. And from that, we derive a private key. And then in the back end, we also retrieve that user's public key. We match the two together, and then silent multi-factor authentication has completed. But one of the key differentiators between what we do and other solutions in the market is at that point, once we've completed that MFA process, we then destroy all those keys. We destroy their private key, their public key, the other symmetric cryptographic keys that we use. And then we regenerate them dynamically. And then we send a new derivative of the private key to the user's device. So every time the silent multi-factor process is run, we are rolling and dynamically creating those keys. So they are only valid for a very short period. And the other thing that I'd say to note is that on the user's device, there is no actual representation of the key. So neither the public key nor the private keys are ever shared with either the end user or the service provider that they are logging into. So we keep those keys absolutely secure and completely separate from either the website they're logging into or the end user's device. We only ever put a cryptographic representation on that end user's device. So in that way, we can make the solution highly secure, and it also offers a very high level of assurance that that is the user that is legitimately allowed to use that website. Okay, so in this way, you don't have to alter the initial way that the user logs in using their initial credentials, but then we run silent MFA in the background without having to ask the user to do anything. And then as soon as that's completed, we destroy and roll all their keys again. So that's a brief explanation of how the solution works. Let's have a look at what it looks like from an end user's perspective. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. We'll actually just run a quick video here, and I'll talk you through what you're seeing on the screen. And we're going to go through a couple of different options here. The first one will be the option where the user is asked to validate their email address with a magic link that we're going to send out. So you can see here that the user's arrived at their banking site. They are now logging in with their normal credentials, which are being authenticated by the enterprise in the normal way. But then they're going to be asked to click on an activate button, in this case, to activate the silent MFA process. Okay, and once they click on that, you can actually see that they're sent an email here just to validate, and this is a one-time process that they'll only see the first time they log in. After this, there is no user interaction. So they click on the magic link and they return back to the website, and it now tells them that silent MFA is activated. And you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen, that was the developer view, was showing you that the auth keys are sent there. Okay, now the next demonstration is the same process, but without actually having any user interaction. So again, they log in with their client number. And we can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, the developer view. So there's no auth key that exists on that end user's device. They click on OK, and there we are sending the browser the auth key. So that is the cryptographic representation of their their private key. And now the last demo here is what happens when they subsequently come to log in. So they click login in the normal way. You can see on the right-hand side there, the browser's already got the auth key in there. So when the user clicks on login, we will run silent MFA, we'll retrieve their existing auth key, we'll roll those keys, dynamically create a new one, send it to the user, and then the user is passed on to the application dashboard. Okay. So those are 3 examples of what the solution looks like for the end user. But the key points here are that it is optional whether to ask the user to validate their email the first time, and that would absolutely be our recommendation. But subsequent to that, there is no user interaction. So the user comes in, puts in their client ID, their password, clicks on OK, and the silent MFA process runs in the background. And you could see that on the right-hand side of that screen, we were showing you what the browser looks like from the developer tools, and we were showing you there that the keys are actually rolled. So you can see that that auth key changed the next time the user came to log in. It's good. Next slide, please. All right, so what kind of attacks do Silent MFA mitigate for the end user? So I guess the key ones here really are the protection against credential stuffing and obviously phishing, because that's a very common attack that we're seeing with our customers today. But obviously from a credential stuffing perspective, if the bad actor is on a device that has not been enrolled into Silent MFA and they manage to brute force or credential stuff the user's user ID and password, that in itself is no good, because once the application kicks off the Silent MFA process, it will try and retrieve that representation of the private key from the end user's device. It will try and retrieve the device fingerprint, and there is no information on the bad actor's machine. So at that point, Silent MFA will fail and the user's login will be blocked. So we can protect against that kind of credential stuffing, that kind of brute force attack that we might see. Also, the other common attack that we can protect against is obviously phishing. If the user is lured to fake website, typically that will be a domain name that very closely matches but is not the same as the legitimate website. And because when we create those cryptographic keys and we send that cryptographic representation to the end user's device, it's stored in such a way that it is linked to the domain, the legitimate domain that the user is logging into. And if those two things do not match, again, the Silent MFA process will grind to a halt. So if the user is lured to some kind of phishing website like EvilGenix, for example, the user's browser will think it's actually connected to the fake website, but we're expecting it to actually be logged into the legitimate website. And as I say, because those two things don't match, the user's browser will not release the legitimate auth keys that's required to complete the silent multi-factor process. Okay? And you can see there also that we can protect from things like shoulder surfing. So if somebody's standing behind a user while they're typing in their user ID and their password and they happen to remember it, and then they go away to a different device, again, because that other device does not contain the right information like the auth key and the device fingerprint, login will fail. Similarly, we'll protect against things like SIM swapping simply because we are not using any out-of-band method to validate the end user. So traditionally, you might see things like OTPs being sent to mobile devices, but because Silent MFA does not rely on that, there is no danger of the user falling foul to SIM swapping and having an SMS OTP intercepted and then used to actually log in. So you can see that we protect against most of the most common attacks that we're seeing against our customers today. And Silent MFA will offer a very high level of assurance and security to protect against those type of issues that we see in the market today. So next slide, please. With that, Dave, I'll hand back to you.
All right, thank you, Simon. Before we open up for questions, I would like to just summarize a little bit what we've just passed through, picking up on the key business benefits of the Silent MFA solution, because they are broad and they are real. And there is a reduced cost of operations based on our experience to date with the clients we've implemented this into. The solution has been able to deliver up to a 60% reduction in cost compared to alternatives that were being considered. There is also, picking up on a number of the things that Simon has just talked through, the reduced risk profile, given the solution's ability to eliminate a number of the most common attack vectors like phishing and credential stuffing. It is real, and this in turn reduces the risk of fraud being perpetrated against your enterprise and your customers. The solution provides a materially improved customer experience that can have a positive impact on both customer satisfaction and NPS scores. You do not have to take your customer base through any change management associated with the solution, especially if you go for a silent implementation. But you also don't have to incur the process of taking your customers out of band or out of brand for them to retrieve some other secret to then retype into your application. The solution itself places enterprises in a position to secure reduced insurance premiums related to cybersecurity coverage while improving regulatory compliance. And there is a fair bit of information on the web and through TELUS as well on how organisations can go about securing that through the implementation of multi-factor authentication. And last but not least, if your business has in place SMS as the means of delivering your one-time passwords for your multi-factor authentication solution, as we've previously talked about, there are no SMS or any other transaction costs associated with the Haventec Silent Multi-Factor Authentication solution because we don't use SMS. All right, with that, I'm going to thank you, and we are going to open up for questions.
Actually, I can see a question, Dave, that's come in there. So, how is silent multi-factor authentication different from traditional MFA?
Well, so let me just, I'm going to start with reiterate one of the points on multi-factor authentication, that it is considered one of the most effective ways to protect an organisation or protect a customer from unauthorised access to valuable information and accounts. And what MFA is, it's a security measure that requires 2 or more proofs of identity to authenticate a user and grant them access to a digital service or a protected asset. Now, how MFA works generally, it typically requires a combination of something the user knows, like a PIN or a password, something the user has, like a physical token or a device, and something the user is, like a biometric fingerprint or face ID. Now, the MFA options that exist in the marketplace at the moment, as consumers, we're probably quite familiar with them, but they include, not limited to, physical tokens, random PINs, biometrics, authenticator apps. Some organisations use email, there's SMS, and there are also software certificate-based multi-factor authentication solutions. So to Haventec Silent Multi-Factor Authentication, this works alongside your existing username and password solution. And once your customers successfully authenticate using their existing username and password, that is the something the user knows component, Haventec Silent Multi-Factor Authentication completes a second authentication check using information from the user's device. That's the something the user has component. Specifically, Haventec Silent Multi-Factor Authentication is a software certificate solution that uses a rolling auth key and your customer's device signature, whether that's their mobile device or their browser from the desktop or tablet, to create the rolling private key, which is matched against the rolling public key to complete the multi-factor authentication. So hopefully that answers the question.
Good, thanks, Dave. Just looking down the list of questions here. Why do we call it silent multi-factor authentication?
So the name itself, internal product team decision to bring to the forefront of the solution the fact that it's not just delivering a privacy enhancing experience or providing additional assurance over the authentication experience, but it's doing that in a way that doesn't require your customers or employees to take any additional steps each time they log into either your business or one of your applications. We did want to highlight, because up until the launch of this, most of the multi-factor authentication solutions required customers or employees to add an additional step to their normal authentication process. And we wanted to highlight the fact that from a customer experience perspective, it is a genuinely silent experience. They do not need to be retrained. They do not need to go through any targeted change management. It is a really silent experience. But I do need to highlight that we have, as part of this, the silent component, a number of organisations that we've talked to have asked if we can include within the authentication user experience some words to say, we have now authenticated you using our silent multi-factor authentication, to provide the customer with some feedback that the brand is providing that level of or that enhanced authentication. And our solution offers that to be included as part of the implementation if the brand wants to, as part of the normal authentication process, just to provide the customer and the employee a reminder that the authentication that they've just completed is protected by silent multi-factor authentication. So to give the user some feedback, some reinforcement that the brand is protecting their accounts with this enhanced authentication solution.
Good. Okay. And the list. How is the solution deployed in my environment? So I'll take that one. So that's a good question. So this is not a rip and replace or an alternative to any of the security solutions you've got in place today. So for example, if you're already using an identity and access management platform to validate and authenticate your end users, that remains in place today, because you are still, from an enterprise perspective, you are authenticating the user using the user ID and the password. Now, once that process is complete, and that will use whatever technologies you have in place today, then the silent MFA solution is invoked, and that can run in a couple of different ways. It is OIDC compliant, so we can do an OIDC redirect from your application to the Haventec platform, which will run the process for you, or it is fully implemented by SDKs and APIs, if that's the way that you would prefer to go. So we can implement it in both of those methods, but the key point here is that you do not need to change or rip and replace anything that you're doing today around authentication. This is a layer that sits underneath that once the user has successfully authenticated. And as I say, we are following industry standards, so either OIDC or RESTful APIs, and it can be implemented in both of those ways. Good. Okay, I think that's it in terms of questions, Dave.
Well, look, I do want to thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Hopefully you got some value from the session and at least got a high-level overview of the Haventec Silent multi-factor authentication solution. We know that consumer education, enhanced enterprise procedures, audits, and greater regulation have slowed down the impacts to privacy. And for many organisations, these have been the primary options that they've relied on to minimise the risk and impact of an account breach, mass account breach, or even a mass data breach. We do want to highlight the fact that enterprises now have access to proven privacy enhancing and multi-factor authentication solutions that allow you to meet the regulatory and customer expectations regarding both privacy and user experience without slowing down your business. If you are interested in learning more or a consultation with some of the team here at Haventec, please do visit us at our website, haventec.com. There's a link there to schedule a consultation process. Again, thank you for your time today. We look forward to hearing from you.